On the day Richard died, I kept my mouth shut about everything that would have detonated the room. The $28 million no one could see, the New York skyscraper recorded in my name, the paperwork that would have turned whispers into sirens. I wore my navy dress because he always said it made my eyes look seaworthy, and I sat in the front pew with my hands folded like I was steadying a ship in weather. People filed past like drifting shadows, the air sweet with lilies and rain-off coats, and I learned a new sound, the way grief hums when you refuse to cry. "You are a devoted wife," someone murmured. "You never complained," another added, and their hands closed over mine as if I were a fragile possession passed from palm to palm. I nodded and thanked them the way a hostess thanks guests for arriving on time. Richard's coffin lay like a dark piano you could not lift the lid on, and the organ pressed low notes that made the glass in the old window shiver. Marcus spoke first. He reached for his father's memory like it was a rope he could still climb, telling a story about a lake and a broken motor and how Richard laughed as if problems were puzzles, not storms. Sarah followed and read a poem whose middle kept breaking. Tears leaked through, bright and annoying, and she dabbed at them like she was blotting ink. Patricia, the ex-wife, stood a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Despite everything," she said, and the congregation leaned forward, the way people do when gossip might turn holy. "He gave me 2 good children." Even that sounded like a truce drafted on thin paper. I kept my face composed and still, a portrait with breath. When the final hymn lifted, I fixed my eyes on the polished lid and told him quietly, "I thought this would be the worst part." The house filled afterward like a lung. Black coats softened into gray talk, and little plates of food made grief look domesticated. I moved through rooms the way I'd learned to move through long illness, checking, smoothing, anticipating before anyone knew they needed anything. On the grand piano, someone had arranged photographs like evidence. Summers, dinners, a sprig of Christmas at someone's throat, a certain yacht ride that had not aged as well as the stories. The chandelier held the light still and glassy. Every object in that house felt newly visible to other people's eyes. I could feel the inventory being taken without clipboards. Handmade carpet, antique mirror, that ridiculous bronze heron Richard pretended to despise and always dusted himself. James, married to Sarah, perpetually polite, sidled up with the stare of a man scouting a cliff path. "I'm so sorry, Alberta," he said. Then, as if the apology had opened a door he couldn't help but step through, "I wondered if Richard left any notes about the practice, any outstanding clients. You know how disorganized he could get when—" I gave him a small smile I'd perfected over 38 years, the kind that says, "Thank you," and "No," and also "Don't." "Everything will be handled," I told him. He nodded as if I'd confirmed his suspicions that everything would not be handled, then retreated to nutritional conversation with a tray of deviled eggs. Across the room, Jennifer, Marcus's wife with the taste for big kitchens, was not whispering so much as murmuring strategically. The market in this neighborhood, even with rates, look at those original fireplaces. I watched her eyes price my mantle, my rugs, my framed blueprints of places we never built. And then there was Cynthia. 3 years in the family, a black dress like sharpened glass, the sort of beauty that looks best reflected in a window you're not supposed to touch. She did not waste smiles. She measured. If I crossed to the kitchen to check the coffee carafes, she was speaking in low voices with Sarah. If I lowered myself for one breath to the chair by the window, she gave me a small, precise smile that felt like cold metal placed against a tooth. I had always known what she thought of me, an occupying presence, an old second wife floating on someone else's fortune. She believed my life was furniture that could be rearranged. By 8:30, the house exhaled. The last careful condolences left on rubber soles, and the door closed with that hollow sound big houses make when they're exhausted. In the kitchen, I stacked plates with hands that had learned steadiness from nights of pills and cups of ice chips. The dishwasher yawned open. I listened to the brittle clink of china against steel and breathed around the ache in my ribs like grief had put 2 fingers there and pressed. Footsteps approached in a way that made the back of my neck know it before my ears. Heavy, deliberate, their own kind of sentence. They stopped at the threshold. "Well, that's over," she said, as if the day had been a project plan completed on schedule. I slid a plate onto the rack and made it look like the most absorbing work on earth. "Thank you for helping," I said, "because I am not an animal that bites when cornered. I'm a woman who waits. Richard would have appreciated it." "Cut the performance," she answered, and the words had an edge, like she had sharpened them against something as she waited for me to turn around. I turned. She stood with her arms wrapped over her chest, mourning stripped away like a coat that didn't fit. Behind her, David couldn't find a place for his hands. Sarah and Marcus flanked him as if this were a vote. "I'm sorry," I said, "because when you cannot predict the next blow, you offer a gentle thing and see who hits it." "The grieving widow routine," she continued. "We need to talk about real things." My hands paused over a bowl that had held peaches once. "What real things?" She tipped her chin toward the ceiling, the walls, the floor we were standing on. "The house, Richard's assets, the business. David and I have discussed it with Marcus and Sarah. We think it's best if you start looking for your own place. Some rooms tilt when you're standing in them. All the angles you trusted shift a few degrees, and your balance goes with them." "My own place," I repeated, without wonder. Sarah cleared her throat, because when someone else says the cruel thing, there's always another person eager to sand it smooth. "Cynthia means just that this is a lot of house for one person, and the upkeep, and I'm telling you to leave," I said, quiet enough to make them feel their volume. Cynthia smiled, and I wondered how long she had practiced that smile in other mirrors. "I'm telling you to be realistic. You're 64, Richard took care of things, and now you should think about something manageable. Downsizing. There are such nice communities now." "Communities," I said, tasting the word the way you taste water you didn't pour yourself. "You never worked, did you?" she asked gently, like a nurse with a needle. "Richard gave you stability, this house, this life. It's time to be practical about what's his and what the family needs." She let her look travel around my kitchen, my cabinets, my battered wooden spoon with the scorch mark from the year Richard insisted he could flambe. "We have college funds to consider," Marcus added, finding a voice he could live in. "Retirement planning," Sarah murmured, as though the words might soften the sound they made. "Richard left a will," I said. "Yes," she replied, and her tone turned mild, the way a person sounds when they're passing you a paper cup of juice on a long flight. "And we'll honor whatever small provision he left for you. But let's be honest, you weren't his partner in the business. You didn't build. You were here." "Just here," I said. And the phrase came to stand in the room beside me like a second woman. 38 years is a long time to be reduced to a preposition. Grief is a clean pain, a knife that does what it says it will do. Humiliation is a dirty one. It leaves a film on the skin that takes days to wash off. I felt the humiliation try to climb me like a vine, and under it, something colder curled, something that had lived in me a long time and knew how to wait out winters. I closed the dishwasher and pressed the button. The machine hummed to life like a thing that trusted me. "Okay," I said. It startled them. "Okay?" David asked, as if I'd misread the script they were staging. "Okay," I repeated. "I'll pack." No tremor, no debate, no appeal to memory or mercy. I turned away from their tribunal and lifted another stack of plates, a woman doing an ordinary chore while her life changed shape behind her. Cynthia blinked, recalculating. "Good," she said, unsure whether the victory tasted the way she'd expected. "That's very mature." They moved back into the living room, their voices lowering and brightening at once, that tinny brightness people get when they treat division as arithmetic instead of surgery. I could hear the soft shuffle of papers that didn't belong to them, the words account and appraisal and distribution passing from mouth to mouth like hard candy that cuts your tongue. I climbed the stairs. In our bedroom, the air still held his aftershave and the ghost of the humidifier the hospice nurse had insisted on. I pulled 2 suitcases from the closet, set them open on the bed that still bowed in the places our bodies had carved into it over the years. I took what a woman takes when she is not fleeing, but choosing. Underthings that fit, 2 dresses that tell the truth, the navy one for luck, 2 pairs of shoes, night cream because you can look like yourself even when no one is watching, the cardigan with the one loose button I always promised to fix and never did. Jewelry trays waited like arguments. I chose the smallest, the thin gold chain with the clasp you have to turn in your mouth to fasten, the wedding band I would not wear tonight, my grandmother's pearls because there are days you must sit very still and be undeniable. I left the rest. I wanted the room to look like I had abandoned something valuable. Downstairs, the framed photographs still smiled with their own teeth. I moved a picture of Richard at 40 into the bottom of my bag, face down. In the hallway mirror, my reflection looked like a woman about to take a breath on the wrong side of a wave. I left a note that read only, "Thank you for hosting," because a small cruelty that sounds like courtesy can echo longer than a shout. When I closed the front door, the night had that suburban hush, the kind that makes every car door sound like a confession. The Hampton Inn off Route 1 has carpet that forgives dragging luggage and a clerk who has mastered the art of seeing without asking. "Name?" he asked, fingers already moving. "Morrison." I said, and it slid back into my mouth so easily, my maiden name, that I understood how simple it is to become invisible if you choose the right letters. 1 week, I added, and counted out cash like a language he and I both preferred. The key card clicked without ceremony. My room smelled like neutral decisions and the lemon-cleaned surfaces of places no one loves. I set the suitcases on the luggage bench, touched the bed with one hand like you pat the side of a horse to let it know you're there. The television made muted people move their mouths to news I didn't need. I turned it off. In the window, the parking lot was a geometry of headlights and lines, and somewhere beyond that geometry, the city pulsed, tall and expensive and, in places, mine. Grief arrived then like a professional. On time, prepared, thorough. I let it. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands on my knees like a woman waiting for good shoes to be delivered, and I cried without performance, the way you cry when no one will put a hand on your arm and say, "They're there," which is a kind of theft. When it was done, I drank 2 glasses of water and washed my face with the small square soap that peels itself into slivers. I drew the curtains just enough to leave a thin seam of parking lot light across the carpet. Then I took my phone from the bag, found the number I knew in my fingers, the way you know the first stare in the dark, and pressed call. "Alberta," Harold said, and the way he said my name was a soft coat thrown around me. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I answered. "I need to see you tomorrow." "My office at 10. "Not your office," I said, and the pause after that told me he could hear the family standing behind my voice even if he couldn't see them. "Somewhere private." He did not ask why. "Text me where," he said. "The Hampton on Route 1, I told him, and added, "Use the side entrance. The lobby cameras are loud." "Understood," he said, and then, because he is a man who has sat at long tables with other men who tear what they didn't build, "How bad is it?" "Bad enough to be instructive," I said, and he exhaled once and we let the call end there. I slept as if sleep were a job I intended to keep. Morning came clean and unasked for. I made bad coffee in a machine that believed in itself and ate a small hotel muffin that tasted like the idea of blueberries. In the mirror, I tied my hair back, tightened the line of my mouth, and put on the navy dress again because continuity is its own weapon. The knock was exactly at 10. Harold has always been the sort of man who arrives when the clock finishes speaking. He came in with a leather briefcase that had seen better tables, looked at me, and the compassion in his face was the unshowy kind, the sort that does not mistake pity for help. I poured him coffee into a paper cup because not all hospitality comes on a tray. "Tell me," he said. So I told him, not in the shape of a complaint, but like a ledger. The funeral, the eyes, the small-bore questions about accounts that weren't theirs, the tribunal in my kitchen, the precise words of the sentence they meant to carry out overnight, the way they dressed their greed and concern and called it family, the part where I said okay and meant it. As I spoke, his jaw shifted a fraction at a time like a man resisting the urge to grind his teeth into something he could throw. "Do they have any idea," he asked carefully, "what is actually yours?" "None," I said. We kept it that way on purpose. Good, he said, and then, because lawyers love an ironclad verb, excellent. He opened the briefcase and took out a folder that had been waiting for years the way a fire extinguisher waits. Everything is in your name, he said, not telling me news, but affirming architecture. Has been for a long while. He wanted it that way. I nodded. He wanted to be seen, I said. I wanted to be safe. Harold's mouth curved into something that could have become a smile in gentler weather. How do you want to play it? The question slid through me like the first note of a song I'd been composing in my head since last night. Slowly, I said. Let them get comfortable. Let them think the house is a caravan they can rearrange. Give them rope. And then, he asked. I lifted my paper cup in a toast to the window, to the parking lot, to the skyline that glinted even from here. Then we see how well they can breathe. He spread documents on the desk under the TV, maps of what I owned, exactly where the bones were buried and which bones were gold. They can contest, but they can't win. Title is clear. Transfers were made years ago. Taxes paid. Filings immaculate. You are not a widow asking for mercy. You are an owner asserting possession. The word possession warmed the room by a degree. What about the house? I asked, because the house was where their voices had echoed, and echoes make liars of us if we let them. You could evict today, he said, but I suspect you prefer education to punishment. Correct, I said. Also, there is satisfaction in letting a thief catalog the silver before you take it away. After he left, I drove back by the house without meaning to. I parked across the street behind a landscaping truck that smelled of soil and gas, and I watched. It is clarifying to watch. A moving van idled like a large, bored animal at the curb. Cynthia stood on the porch with a clipboard she had probably found in the mudroom and an expression that said she'd been promoted to general of a war she invented. She pointed left, right, up. Men carried boxes labeled home office and guest linens and a fragile sticker that made me think of a glass swan from a trip to Venice I took without them before any of them had opinions about my life. David texted as if the house itself had asked me to reach me. Hope you found somewhere okay. Cynthia organizing Dad's office, found business files. Can you help us go through? I let the message sit on the lock screen and watched it lose urgency by the minute until it looked like any other text from a past version of a person. I turned the car toward downtown, toward the tall buildings that hold secrets the way aquariums hold fish. Shining, moving, silent. At First National, Margaret greeted me with a professionalism that manages to be tender without leaving fingerprints. Mrs. Morrison, she said, and her eyes softened the way people's eyes do when someone they know is suddenly on the far side of a sentence that begins, "He passed." I handed her what Harold had prepared and watched the clean surprise lift her brows and then be tucked away again, because the best bankers are librarians of astonishment. We can execute these today. Please. As she processed signatures that would have whistled in Cynthia's throat if she'd heard them, I pictured my closet at home like a little theater where she stood in my shoes and tried on poses she thought belonged to the role. Letter. A costume is not a part. It's fabric. My phone rang again while Margaret stapled joyless receipts to serious paper. Alberta, Cynthia's voice said into my ear bright and tight at once, we found some confusing documents in Richard's desk. Legal language that doesn't make sense. Could you call me? There are things you need to explain. I could hear the party trick failing in the background, the sound people make when they realize the rabbit in the hat has a deed and a lawyer. I let the message finish and lowered the phone back into my bag. Margaret slid the last document across. All set, she said. Would you like copies? Yes, I said. Then, because a woman can enjoy a small luxury on a day that feels like a verdict, and I'll take a receipt for the penthouse renovation fund transfer. She did not blink. Of course. Back in the hotel, the afternoon leaned against the window like a tired relative. I took off my shoes, set them together like teammates, and stood in my stocking feet in the thin seam of light between the curtains. The room hummed. My phone lay face down on the desk, It glowed once with a new message and then surrendered. I watched my reflection watch me until the glass grew darker and the woman in it steadied. When night arrived and the parking lot lights flicked on, they made the cars look like chess pieces waiting for hands. I ordered dinner on a tray I didn't need. When it came, I ate with the deliberate appetite of someone who intends to work. A steak you could cut with the flat side of the knife, asparagus that tried to taste like spring, and a glass of wine as medicinal as a signature. Somewhere in the middle of that meal, I laughed. Just once, the kind of short laugh that surprises a mouth into a better shape. Tomorrow would gather itself. Tomorrow would wear its suit and bring its folders and say, "Let's begin." Tonight belonged to the invisible woman who was not invisible anymore. To the widow who had said "okay" in a kitchen and meant something else entirely. I rinsed the glass in the bathroom sink so it wouldn't stain and slid between hotel sheets that felt like paper no one had written on. Before I turned off the lamp, I texted Harold one line. "I prefer Monday." He replied, "They've retained counsel. Will reading 2 p.m. You in?" I typed, "Absolutely," and set the phone down. The room clicked and settled. The hum of the little refrigerator sounded like a distant city. I closed my eyes and pictured the house from the street, the porch light Cynthia had left on to welcome herself home, and let a small, private smile climb as far as it wanted. In the morning, I would wake and fasten my pearls, and the world would look exactly as it had yesterday and be entirely different. Morning sunlight pushed through the thin hotel curtains like an intruder too polite to knock. Alberta sat at the desk with a paper cup of coffee, her back straight, her fingers steady, as she scrolled through messages she had no intention of answering. Cynthia had sent 3 overnight. Curt, demanding, increasingly anxious. "Call me back. You don't understand what you're leaving behind. We found papers. Explain this." Alberta deleted them, one by one, as calmly as she had once deleted spam about miracle diets. At exactly 10, Harold arrived with the same gravity as a judge taking his bench. His briefcase thudded onto the desk, spilling the weight of its contents into the small hotel room. "They've retained counsel," he said without preamble. "Jackson Morrison, no relation. Monday, 2 p.m., formal reading of the will. They insisted." Alberta sipped her coffee, eyes cool. Perfect. Harold studied her, and though he had represented her for 15 years, she saw him hesitate now. "You're ready to expose everything?" She looked out the window where the highway pulsed with ordinary cars. "I've been ready for 15 years, she said. The weekend dragged itself forward like a beast chained. Alberta spent it deliberately, each hour a blade she sharpened. Saturday morning, she visited her penthouse downtown, brushing her hand across the marble counter she had chosen herself, staring out at the skyline Richard's children believed belonged to their father. She let the view remind her who she was. Saturday evening, she walked into a boutique where the lighting made every stitch look deliberate. She chose a navy suit tailored to precision, her grandmother's pearls, and carried out a Cartier watch in its velvet box, a gift Richard had given her decades earlier that suddenly felt like armor. Sunday night, she left the Hampton Inn behind and checked into the Fairmont Hotel. If invisibility had been her weapon, visibility would be her revenge. She ordered lobster and champagne from room service, spread Harold's documents across the dining table, and studied them under the gold light of the chandelier. Deeds, transfers, bank accounts, property valuations. Each page was a blade, and she intended to unsheath them one at a time. When Monday arrived, it brought rain again, light but insistent, as if the world itself conspired to remind everyone of Richard's funeral. Alberta dressed carefully, painted her face with practiced precision, and walked into Morrison and Associates 15 minutes early. The receptionist looked at her the way young people look at the elderly, curious, dismissive, almost impatient. "You're here for the Holloway estate reading?" she asked. Alberta folded her gloves slowly, then said,
I am the Holloway estate. Something in her tone snapped her girl's head up. She stammered and pointed her toward the waiting room. The voices came before the door opened. Sharp, impatient, familiar. Cynthia's was the loudest. Why is she even here? She's not a real beneficiary. Marcus replied with brittle anger. Dad supported her. That doesn't mean she gets everything. Sarah's voice was sharper than usual, almost shrill. Then the law requires her presence. We can't move forward without her. Alberta sat in a leather chair, hands folded neatly, her face arranged into the calm mask they had always mistaken for passivity. Inside, her blood moved like cold current. At precisely 2, Harold entered with Catherine Walsh, a tall, sharp-eyed attorney whose presence made the air itself tense. She nodded once to Alberta, then set a heavy briefcase on the polished conference table. Across the room, Cynthia adjusted her black blazer like she was preparing for battle. David sat beside her, shoulders hunched, eyes darting between his siblings, avoiding Alberta altogether. Marcus leaned forward in his chair like a man about to demand explanations. Sarah clutched a notebook like it was a shield. Jackson Morrison, the family's hired lawyer, began reading the will in a monotone voice that suggested he wanted to be anywhere else. The first paragraphs were ceremonial, sound mind, sound body, formalities. Then came the bequests. To my children, Marcus, Sarah, and David, I leave the sum of $50,000 each, to be distributed equally among them. The air cracked. Marcus frowned as if he'd misheard. Sarah's pen stilled. Cynthia's mouth tightened into a pale line. Jackson continued, and to my beloved wife, Alberta Morrison Holloway, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests, to be hers absolutely and without restriction. Silence. Not respectful silence. Stunned, broken silence. It was Cynthia who spoke first, her voice sharp enough to slice the room in two. Excuse me, could you repeat that last part? Jackson cleared his throat, uncomfortable. The bulk of Mr. Holloway's estate goes to his widow, as is customary. What exactly does that include? Sarah demanded, her face blotched red. Catherine Walsh leaned forward with professional calm. According to these documents, Mrs. Morrison inherits all real property, all financial accounts, all business assets, and all personal property not otherwise specified. That's impossible, Marcus snapped. Dad would never leave us with scraps. Harold's voice slid into the conversation like a knife cutting cloth. It's not only possible, it's perfectly legal. Richard was very clear about his intentions. Cynthia slammed her hand on the table. She didn't earn any of this. She never worked. She was just there. The echo's words, the same words Cynthia had flung at her in the kitchen days earlier, the words that had crawled into her chest and settled like thorns. Alberta stood slowly, every eye in the room drawn to the steady elegance of her movement. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced sharper than any shout. You're absolutely right, Cynthia. I didn't build Richard's consulting firm. That was his. Confusion flickered across their faces. This wasn't the defense they expected. But what you don't understand is that Richard's estate isn't what you think it is, and I am not who you think I am. Catherine opened her briefcase and laid the first folder on the table. The sound of paper against polished wood was louder than thunder. This is the deed to the Holloway residence. Note the name on the title. Cynthia snatched the document, her hands trembling. She stared, color draining from her face. Alberta Morrison, she whispered. Sarah grabbed it next, scanning in disbelief. This has to be fake. Dad bought that house years before. Harold interrupted, his tone smooth. Correct. He refinanced in 2007. Mrs. Morrison provided the capital. Ownership transferred then. Richard retained occupancy rights, but full ownership was hers. Cynthia's voice cracked. That can't be true. She never had money. Catherine's smile was small and cold. On the contrary, Mrs. Morrison has been independently wealthy since her first marriage. She has chosen discretion over display. She slid another folder across the table. Morrison Holdings, LLC. 17 properties in 3 states, 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan, 2 office buildings in Boston, and she paused, letting the weight fall. A recently renovated warehouse in Soho, appraised at $28 million. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ragged breath of disbelief. Marcus leaned back as if someone had struck him. Sarah whispered, "$28 million?" Harold added, almost gently, "That's just one property. The total value of Mrs. Morrison's holdings exceeds $47 million, excluding Richard's modest assets." Cynthia's composure cracked. Her voice trembled between rage and fear. "You lied to us. All these years, you let us think—" Alberta leaned forward, her voice calm, deliberate. "I didn't make you believe anything. You revealed yourselves. You called me names. You threw me out of my own home the night my husband died. You showed me who you are when you thought I was powerless. Now you know the truth. And the truth is, you've been living in my house, making plans for my assets, sitting in rooms that were never yours." Sarah's pen slipped from her hand and clattered on the table. Marcus's face blanched. David finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Then, what happens now?" Catherine answered with brutal precision. "Legally, you inherit exactly what your father left you, $50,000 each. As for your current residence—" She paused, her gaze locking on Cynthia. "You're trespassing." The word landed like a hammer. Cynthia's lips parted, but no sound came. Alberta gathered her gloves, her purse, and stood. "I'll give you 72 hours to remove your belongings from my property. After that, the locks change." She walked to the door without looking back.
Cynthia's voice cracked behind her, high and desperate. "Alberta, please! We can work this out! We're family!" Alberta paused with her hand on the door, her reflection framed in the glass. Her voice was soft, almost kind. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you treated me. You taught me what the word means to you. Now live with it." She stepped into the hallway, the echo of her heels sharp, final. The storm had only begun.
The rain had stopped by the time Alberta stepped out of Morrison and Associates, but the streets still gleamed like they had been lacquered in black glass. Her reflection stretched long and thin across puddles as she walked to her car, her heels clicking like a metronome. The city felt alive in a way she hadn't noticed in years. Every honk, every shout, every neon reflection seemed to bend toward her, whispering a reminder. She was not invisible anymore. Back at the Fairmont, she ordered nothing but tea. No champagne this time, no indulgence, just hot, dark liquid she held between her palms while she looked out at the skyline. Cynthia's desperate words echoed in her ears. "We're family." Alberta had almost laughed in that moment. Family had stood in her kitchen 3 nights after her husband's death and told her to pack her bags. Family had cut her grief into fractions and weighed her against property value. No, she thought as the tea cooled. They were never family. They were scavengers. By midnight, her phone had filled with messages again. Marcus tried first, measured, businesslike. "We should discuss options, perhaps an arrangement." Sarah followed, short, brittle, defensive. "You blindsided us. That wasn't fair." But Cynthia's were the longest, unraveling between apology and command. "We didn't mean what we said that night. Things were heated. We can work together. But if you go through with this, you'll regret it." Alberta read each one slowly, then deleted them without reply. Silence was sharper than any insult.
The first morning of the countdown, she drove back to the Holloway residence. Not to enter, not yet, but to watch. From across the street, she saw curtains twitching, silhouettes moving frantically. A rental van idled in the driveway, its back open like a hungry mouth. Cynthia stood on the porch barking orders, her voice carrying even through the closed windows. Marcus lifted boxes, his jaw clenched. Sarah scribbled on a notepad. David trailed behind them like a ghost, carrying nothing heavier than guilt. Alberta sat in her car, hands folded on the steering wheel, and allowed herself a small smile. Let them sweat. Let them taste the panic of losing what they thought they owned. By noon, her phone rang again. This time, David. His voice cracked like a boy's. "Alberta, please, Cynthia's upset. Sarah's worried. Can't we figure out a compromise?" She let the silence stretch so long that he began to stammer. Finally, she said, "David, when you stood in my kitchen and let your wife call me names, what compromise did you offer me?" He swallowed audibly. I didn't. I was scared. I didn't know what to say. "And now you're scared again, but your fear is not my responsibility." She ended the call without reply. That evening, she met Harold again in the hotel's quiet bar. The room smelled of polished wood and expensive whiskey. Harold said as he sipped his drink, "They're unraveling. I've received 2 calls from their attorney already. They're grasping at straws, asking if Richard might have left undisclosed assets or claiming undue influence." Alberta's mouth curved slightly. "Let them try. Every document is clean. Every transfer was made years ago." Harold nodded, his eyes glinting. "They underestimated you, Alberta. That was their first mistake. Their second was showing you their cruelty."
On the second day, Cynthia escalated. A long message appeared on Alberta's phone, written in bursts of rage. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You've manipulated everyone. You're not family. You never were. Richard would be ashamed." Alberta read it twice, then set the phone aside and opened her notebook. She wrote a list of tasks. Schedule locksmith. Arrange cleaning crew. Call property manager. Each stroke of the pen was steady, practical. Her emotions had burned themselves into something colder. Resolve. That afternoon, she drove not to the house, but to her Soho building. The warehouse-turned lofts stretched high into the sky, its steel bones gleaming. 15 years ago, Richard had dismissed the purchase as foolish, a crumbling shell in a forgotten neighborhood. But Alberta had seen the future in the cracks of those bricks. She walked through the lobby now, greeted by the doorman who knew her only as Mrs. Morrison, the owner who rarely appeared. The marble floor glowed under the light, and voices echoed from the lofts above, tenants paying rents higher than Richard's consulting firm ever earned in a month. This, she thought as she touched the railing, was my life's work, and they never knew. Evening fell. At the Fairmont, she dined alone on roast chicken and asparagus, the simplest meal she could order, eaten with the dignity of a queen. Outside, the city glittered, while somewhere across town, Cynthia sat in her house plotting like a cornered animal. Alberta pictured her rifling through drawers, imagining treasure maps hidden among Richard's papers, only to find outdated invoices and client lists worth nothing. The thought made her laugh quietly, a sound that startled even her. On the third morning, the final day of her 72-hour mercy, Harold arrived again. He carried new documents, eviction notices already prepared. "By law, you could serve these now, but I thought you prefer the drama of the deadline." Alberta traced the edge of the papers with one finger. "Yes," she said softly, "drama teaches better than law." Her phone buzzed again that afternoon, this time an unknown number. She answered only to hear Cynthia's voice, brittle with desperation. "Alberta, please listen to me. We were wrong. I was wrong. I said terrible things. But you can't just throw us out. We have nowhere to go." Alberta's voice remained calm. "Cynthia, you had somewhere to go. You chose to occupy my home instead. That was your mistake.
We're family, she snapped. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Alberta's eyes hardened. Family is who holds you when you grieve, not who shoves you into the street. You made your definition clear. Now live with it. She ended the call. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she walked through the penthouse suite, her bare feet silent against the plush carpet. The city glowed beneath her, indifferent and eternal. She thought of Richard, not the man in the coffin, but the man who had once laughed at midnight over burnt pancakes, who had whispered apologies when he knew his children's resentment cut her. He had trusted her enough to sign everything into her name years ago. She whispered into the window, her reflection faint beside the skyline. You gave me the tools. Now I'll use them.
The 72 hours closed like a fist. The next evening, Alberta drove back to the house one final time. Cars crowded the driveway, boxes stacked haphazardly near the porch. Through the front window, she saw them, Cynthia pacing, Marcus arguing, Sarah near tears, David slumped in silence. It looked less like a family and more like a storm tearing itself apart. Alberta sat in her car for a long moment, watching the lights glow warm against the gathering dark. Then she stepped out, heels clicking against the pavement, each sound a reminder that the house was hers and always had been. When she reached the door, she did not knock. She slid her key into the lock and opened it. The voices inside froze. Heads turned. Cynthia's face drained of color. Alberta stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the last light of day. 72 hours, she said softly. Time's up. The door swung open with the kind of finality that could silence a storm. Alberta stepped inside, heels pressing sharp against the hardwood floor she had polished for 15 years. The air was thick, tense, scented faintly of stale coffee and cardboard. Boxes littered the hallway. Someone had dragged furniture toward the living room, as if rearranging it could lay claim. For a long second, no one spoke. It was Cynthia who broke the silence, her voice unsteady. What are you doing here? Alberta closed the door behind her, turning the key slowly, deliberately, as though sealing them inside with her. Unlocking my own house, she said. Her tone was soft, but cut like glass. Did you forget? I told you, 72 hours. Marcus stood, his face blotched red. We're still moving things. You can't just barge in. I didn't barge in, Alberta replied, slipping her gloves off with care. I used my key, the key that belongs to the rightful owner. She placed the gloves neatly on the hall table, next to a photograph of Richard smiling in better years. Her eyes lingered on his face before she turned back to them. Time is up. In the living room, Sarah looked pale, clutching a half-packed box as though it might shield her. David sat hunched by the window, hands twisted together, saying nothing. But Cynthia stood in Richard's favorite chair like it was a throne she had been auditioning for. Her blazer was crisp, her chin high, but her eyes betrayed panic. We were hoping to talk, to find a settlement. Alberta walked into the room slowly, surveying the half-empty shelves, the stacks of their belongings piled like loot after a raid. A settlement, she repeated, for living in my house rent-free, for throwing me out 3 nights after my husband died. She let the words settle, heavy and undeniable. Tell me, Cynthia, what exactly do you think I owe you? Cynthia's parents were there too. Tom and Linda Patterson, perched uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa. They looked out of place, dressed too formally for a family argument, their faces caught between disbelief and embarrassment. Tom cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison, we were told there was some dispute over the will. We thought perhaps a compromise. Alberta turned to them, her eyes cool but steady. There is no dispute. The will was read, the documents are clear. Everything belongs to me. What your daughter failed to mention is that it always did. Linda's mouth opened, then closed again,
Her gaze flicked towards Cynthia, who shifted uncomfortably. "Is that true?" Linda asked her daughter, her voice sharp. Cynthia's face flushed. "It's complicated, Mom." "It's not complicated," Alberta cut in. "Your daughter evicted me from my own home at my husband's funeral. She called me names. She treated me like nothing. And all the while, she was sitting in a house she never owned, planning a future that was never hers to claim." The room fell silent. Alberta could feel the weight of her words pressing down, could see the shame settling over Cynthia's parents like a heavy coat. Tom stood, his face red with anger, not at Alberta, but at his daughter. "Cynthia Marie Patterson," he said, his voice low but searing, "did you throw this woman out of her own house?" "Dad, answer me." Cynthia's eyes darted between her parents and Alberta. For the first time, her confidence cracked wide open. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Tom snapped. He turned to Alberta, his expression grave. "Mrs. Morrison, on behalf of our family, I'm ashamed. You deserved better." He reached for his wife's hand. "We're leaving."
Linda looked at Alberta with quiet apology before following her husband out. The door closed behind them with a final click, and Alberta knew Cynthia had just lost the last of her allies. The silence that followed was electric. Alberta turned her gaze back to the others, each one avoiding her eyes. "You have 20 minutes," she said softly. "Collect what's yours and leave. After that, I change the locks." Sarah sputtered, her voice thin. "You can't just—" "I can," Alberta interrupted, her tone flat. "And I will." Marcus swore under his breath, grabbing a box and storming past her. His footsteps echoed down the hall, the front door slamming behind him. Sarah followed more quietly, her face blotched with tears, clutching her belongings like scraps of a dream. David lingered, moving slowly, as though every step cost him. When he finally reached the door, he looked back at Alberta, his mouth opening, then closing again. No words came. He walked out. Cynthia was the last. She stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. Alberta stepped closer, her voice steady, unshaken. "Yes, it is. You ended it when you showed me who you are." Cynthia glared, her chest heaving, but said nothing more. She grabbed her bag and stalked out, the door slamming so hard the frames on the wall rattled. And then there was silence. Real silence. Not the brittle silence of suppressed arguments, but the deep, heavy quiet of a house that had been reclaimed. Alberta stood alone in the center of the living room, her chest rising and falling slowly. The chandelier above cast its soft light over the boxes they had left behind, over the spaces where their greed had been carved into the walls. She looked around, taking in the emptiness, and felt something shift inside her. Not grief, not yet peace, but freedom. She walked through the house slowly, touching the banister, the mantel, the doorway of the kitchen where she had once stood, loading dishes as Cynthia delivered her verdict. The humiliation of that night still burned, but now it was tempered with something colder, sharper: vindication. She had given them 72 hours, she had given them rope, and they had hung themselves with it. Upstairs, in the bedroom she had shared with Richard, the suitcases she had packed days earlier still sat on the bed. She opened them, placed the clothes back into drawers, set the jewelry back into its trays. Each act was deliberate, symbolic, like a queen reclaiming her throne. Finally, she set Richard's photograph back on the nightstand, his eyes smiling at her in silent approval. When she returned downstairs, Harold was waiting in the foyer. He had arrived quietly, as though he knew instinctively when the battle had ended. "They're gone?" he asked. "They're gone," Alberta confirmed. He nodded, pulling a folded document from his case. "The locksmith will be here in 20 minutes. After that, this house is entirely yours again." Alberta looked around one last time at the quiet, reclaimed space. "It always was," she said softly.
The locksmith arrived promptly, tools clinking, locks turning. With each click of metal, the house shifted further from shadow back into belonging. By the time he left, Alberta held the new keys in her hand, their weight both familiar and new. She closed the door behind him, locked it with a steady hand, and let the silence wash over her. For the first time since Richard's death, she allowed herself to breathe.
The morning after the house emptied felt different. The air itself was lighter, the walls no longer vibrating with whispered judgments or the scrape of boxes across wood floors. Alberta rose early, sunlight spilling across the quilt she had laid back on the bed. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel like a guest in her own life. She brewed coffee in the kitchen, the aroma curling through the house, filling every corner they had tried to claim. The sound of the machine's sputtering was oddly triumphant. Each cup she poured felt like a declaration. I am still here. This is mine. At the kitchen table, Harold's documents lay spread like maps of a new country. Deeds, bank statements, property portfolios, all hers. She traced her finger across the bold black letters of her name on every page. It was more than ownership. It was proof. Proof that the life Richard's children thought they were entitled to had been built by her long before they ever decided she didn't belong. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Cynthia. Alberta didn't bother opening it. She could already imagine the tone, half accusation, half desperation. In the silence of her kitchen, Alberta smiled faintly. Cynthia's power had been illusion, built on bluster and arrogance. Without Richard's name to wield, she was just a woman with sharp words and nothing behind them. Later that morning, Alberta drove downtown to the First National branch. The marble lobby glowed beneath sunlight streaming through tall windows. Margaret Chen, her personal banker, greeted her with quiet deference. Mrs. Morrison, everything has been processed. The transfers are complete. She handed over neatly organized folders, each stamped and signed. Alberta accepted them with calm satisfaction. Thank you, Margaret. Privacy remains our priority. Margaret nodded, her expression solemn. Of course. No one outside this office knows a thing. Walking back to her car, Alberta felt the weight of the folders like currency in her hands. Not just money, but leverage, freedom, power. She slid into the driver's seat and allowed herself a deep breath. Richard's children thought they had won something by forcing her out of her own home. What they hadn't realized was that they had sparked something far bigger. Their cruelty had awakened her patience, sharpened her resolve. Now they would see what it meant to cross a woman who had learned to play the long game. That afternoon, Alberta visited her Soho building. The warehouse she had bought decades ago now rose tall and gleaming, its brick facade polished, its windows reflecting the city skyline. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of leather and expensive perfume. Tenants passed her without recognition, artists, professionals, people paying rents higher than Richard's consulting firm had ever earned in a month. Alberta rode the elevator to the top floor, stepped into the penthouse loft, and looked out at the city below. The skyline was hers, piece by piece, and not a single one of Richard's children knew it until last week. The thought filled her with a satisfaction so deep it was almost physical. That evening, she returned to her house and prepared dinner alone. Salmon seared in butter, asparagus laid neatly on porcelain plates, a glass of white wine poured carefully. She ate at the dining table where, only days earlier, Jennifer had whispered about property value. Now, in the quiet, Alberta felt the ghost of those whispers dissolve. Every bite was deliberate, ceremonial. She had survived humiliation, betrayal, grief. She had been pushed out, dismissed, treated as disposable. And now, she was sitting exactly where she belonged, stronger than ever. The next morning brought news she hadn't expected, but relished all the same. Harold called, his tone edged with amusement. They have hired another attorney. They're asking questions about hidden accounts, insisting Richard must have left something more. Alberta laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. Let them look. They'll find scraps. Harold chuckled. Scraps, yes, but their desperation is showing. They've realized too late what they've lost. By midday, the gossip had begun. Alberta heard it first from a neighbor who called to check in. Word was the Holloway children had been left almost nothing, that the widow had inherited everything. Alberta listened politely, never correcting, never confirming, letting rumor do the work of truth. That evening, her phone rang again. David. His voice was softer this time, almost pleading. Alberta, I wanted to say I'm sorry for what we did, for standing there while Cynthia. He faltered. It was wrong. Alberta said nothing at first, letting silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Finally, she replied, Yes, it was wrong. He swallowed hard. Is there anything I can do? She let his question hang. Then, calmly, You can learn to live without what was never yours. That would be a start. And she ended the call. Meanwhile, Cynthia's unraveling accelerated. More messages arrived, this time frantic. We need to meet. You can't just cut us off. Richard wouldn't have wanted this. Alberta read them at night in her bedroom, her lamp casting golden light over crisped sheets. Each message felt weaker than the last, a woman's confidence eroding as reality pressed harder. Alberta never responded. On the third day, Harold arrived again, bringing news that made Alberta's lips curve into a satisfied smile. Their accounts are strained. Cynthia and David burned through their savings, trying to maintain the lifestyle they assumed would be theirs. Without the house, without the assets, they're exposed. He laid down papers showing failed applications, debts creeping close. It's only a matter of time. Alberta looked at the documents, then back at Harold. Good, she said. Let them feel it. Let them learn what entitlement costs. That night, she stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The house was hers again, the silence hers, the life hers. For the first time since Richard's death, she felt the weight of betrayal lifting, replaced by something steadier. Control. Phase 1 had been survival. Phase 2 was reclamation. And Phase 3, well, that would be education. The family had thought they were expelling a burden. In truth, they had awakened an adversary. Alberta intended to show them that assumptions are dangerous things, and the most expensive lessons are the ones you never forget.
The silence of the reclaimed house did not last long. It never does when people refuse to accept their own defeat. Within a week of the eviction, Alberta began receiving calls not only from Cynthia, but from Marcus and Sarah, too. Their voices carried new inflections, less rage, more pleading. Entitlement had begun to wilt into desperation. Alberta did not answer. She let their words rot on voicemail, where they sounded smaller and smaller each day. One evening, she poured herself a glass of Bordeaux and listened to 3 messages in a row. Marcus's tone was clipped, almost bureaucratic. Look, Alberta, this is getting ridiculous. We can come to some arrangement. 50,000 doesn't go far these days. Dad would have wanted fairness. Sarah's was more fragile, guilt-tinged. Please, we were grieving. You know how emotions run high. Can't we sit down like family? And then Cynthia's, long, fractured, on the edge of breaking. You don't understand what you're doing. David and I, things are difficult. You can't just cut us off. That's not what Richard would have wanted. Please, please call me. Alberta swirled the wine in her glass, listening to their voices fade into silence. She thought about calling back, just to say the words she had waited decades to use. Fairness isn't your inheritance. It's your reflection. And you don't like what you see. But she didn't. Silence was sharper. Silence was education. The next day, she visited Harold in his office. He was reviewing papers when she entered, his glasses perched low on his nose. They've filed an inquiry with probate court, he said without preamble, trying to argue undue influence, claiming you manipulated Richard in his final years.
Alberta laughed softly, a sound so cold it startled even Harold. Manipulated? Richard was many things, Harold, but malleable was never one of them. He signed those transfers 15 years ago when he was stronger than any of them put together. Harold nodded. I've already drafted the response. Ironclad. This will go nowhere. Alberta leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. Good. Let them waste their money on lawyers. Let them feel the drain. She paused, then smiled faintly. Consider it tuition, the cost of their education. That afternoon, she drove to her Soho building again. The tenants greeted her with polite nods, not recognizing the quiet woman who owned their homes. She walked through the lobby, watching the doorman tip his hat. Upstairs, in the penthouse loft, she looked out at the city skyline. From here, she could see towers of steel and glass, structures people assumed belonged to powerful men. Yet some of them were hers, hidden behind shell companies and quiet investments. She thought of Richard's children staring at outdated files, imagining treasure, never realizing the real fortune had always been in her hands. Back at home that evening, she received another call from David. This time, she answered. His voice cracked with exhaustion. Alberta, it's bad. Cynthia, she's falling apart. She won't sleep. She keeps saying you ruined us. Alberta's reply was calm, measured. I didn't ruin you, David. I revealed you. There's a difference. She says you don't care, he whispered. Cynthia is right about one thing. I don't care about saving her from herself. She wanted me gone, and now she is the one gone. That's how the world balances. David said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, I wish I had stood up for you. Alberta let his words hang, then replied softly, So do I. She ended the call, her face expressionless, but inside something stirred. A small pang, the ghost of maternal instinct she had once felt for the boy she had helped raise.
The next morning, Harold sent her documents showing the children's finances. They had borrowed heavily, convinced the inheritance would cover everything. With only $50,000 each, debts now closed in like wolves. Creditors circled. Cynthia and David's marriage was fraying under the weight of late bills and unpaid balances. Sarah's husband had begun pressuring her to sell whatever jewelry or heirlooms she had left. Marcus was drowning in a mortgage he couldn't maintain. Alberta read every line carefully, her lips curving slightly. Education, she thought. Every lesson comes with a cost. They're finally paying theirs. Word spread in the neighborhood, too. Whispered conversations in the grocery store, curious looks at church. Everyone knew the Holloway children had been cut out, that the widow had inherited everything. Alberta could feel the shift in the air when she walked into shops or restaurants. Some people gave her respectful nods, others stared, whispers trailing behind her. She ignored them all. She had lived too long being underestimated to care about being seen now. Cynthia, however, could not bear the whispers. Alberta heard through neighbors that she had been spotted arguing loudly in public, her voice rising, calling Alberta names that drew stares. Once, Alberta received a photo anonymously, a blurry image of Cynthia sitting in her car, mascara streaked down her face, a bottle of wine in the cup holder. Alberta studied the photo for a long moment before deleting it. She felt no pity. Cynthia had chosen her cruelty. Now she was living inside it. One evening, as Alberta sat in her garden watching the roses bend in the twilight, David arrived unannounced. He stood at the gate, hesitant, a shadow of the boy she had once known. Alberta considered leaving him there, but something in his posture, defeated, hollow, made her open the gate. He stepped inside slowly, his shoulders hunched. I wanted to see you, he said softly. Alberta gestured to a chair across from her. They sat in silence for a long time, the scent of roses thick between them. Finally, David spoke. Cynthia's gone. She left 3 weeks ago, took what money we had left, and went back to her parents. Alberta raised her glass of wine, sipping slowly. She always preferred taking to building. David's eyes flicked up to hers, raw and vulnerable. I don't know what to do.
I've lost everything. My wife, my home, my family. I don't even know who I am without all of it." Alberta set her glass down carefully. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "That is the first honest thing you've said to me in months." He looked at her, almost pleading. "Can you help me?" She studied him for a long moment, seeing not just the man, but the boy she had once raised, the boy who had scraped his knees and come to her for bandages, who had once called her mom without hesitation. For the first time since Richard's death, her resolve wavered just slightly. "I can't save you from your choices, David," she said quietly. "But I can tell you this. You're stronger than you think. If you stop clinging to what you think you're owed, you might finally start building something that's yours." David's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded slowly. He stood, thanked her softly, and left without another word. Alberta watched him go, her heart heavy, but steady. As the gate clicked shut behind him, Alberta turned back to her roses. Their petals glowed faintly in the fading light, delicate yet resilient. She reached out and touched one gently. "Everything has a cost," she whispered. "Even forgiveness." Phase 2 of her plan was complete. The house was hers, the fortune secure, and the family stripped bare of their illusions. Now came Phase 3, deciding who, if any of them, deserved a second chance, and who would remain exiled forever.
The calls from Marcus and Sarah began quietly, almost tentative. At first, Alberta ignored them, letting their apologies pile up in her voicemail like leaves swept into a corner. But one afternoon, as she sat in the study with Harold's folders still open on the desk, she pressed play. Sarah's voice was soft, careful. "Alberta, it's me. I don't know how to say this. I was wrong. We were wrong. That night, I let Cynthia say things I should have stopped. I didn't defend you, and I'll regret that. Please, can we talk?" The next message was Marcus, clipped and blunt. "Look, Alberta, I know things went badly. Too far. But Dad wouldn't want us like this. He wouldn't want us divided. I want to fix it. For the family." Alberta leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The words didn't move her. They were too practiced, too late. Yet underneath, she heard something else. Fear. Fear of the bills piling, of reputations crumbling, of lives that had never been built on their own strength. They were reaching out not because they loved her, but because they needed her. That evening, she walked through the house, tucking the walls as if listening for Richard's voice in the plaster. Would he have wanted her to reconcile? Perhaps. He had always been softer with his children, blind to the ways they cut her down, but Alberta had lived in their contempt for too long to mistake need for love. Days later, Sarah appeared unannounced at the front gate. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger, smaller. She held a bouquet of flowers. Roses, badly chosen, almost wilted. Alberta watched from the window for a long moment before opening the door. "Alberta," she whispered. "Please?" Alberta stepped aside, letting her in. The younger woman walked nervously through the foyer, her eyes darting over the furniture as though it had changed shape since she had last seen it. They sat in the living room, across from each other. "I'm sorry," she said, quickly, the words spilling. "That night, we weren't thinking. We were angry, we were grieving. Cynthia, she pushed us, and we followed. I shouldn't have." Alberta watched her quietly. "And now?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Now, everything is falling apart. James is furious. We can't keep up with the bills. People whisper behind our backs. I feel like I'm drowning."
There it was, the truth, raw and unvarnished. Not just apology, but desperation. Alberta leaned forward, her voice soft. "And what do you expect from me, Sarah? A lifeline or forgiveness?" Sarah's tears fell. "Both." Alberta sat back, folding her hands. "Forgiveness is earned. A lifeline is a gift. You've earned neither." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah sobbed quietly, but Alberta did not move to comfort her. After several minutes, Sarah stood,
clutching the wilted flowers to her chest. "I understand," she whispered, and left without another word. The next day, Marcus called again. This time, Alberta answered. His voice was tight, controlled. "Sarah came to see you, didn't she?" "She did. I'll be blunt. We can't survive like this. We need help. If you could—" "Marcus," Alberta interrupted, her tone sharp. "You had a chance to stand with me when I needed family. Instead, you stood with Cynthia. You chose greed over love. Why should I help you now?" He was silent for a long moment. "Because we're blood." Alberta laughed then, a sound so cold Marcus flinched through the line. "Blood isn't family. Actions are." And she ended the call. But Cynthia was different. Word reached Alberta through neighbors and Harold that she was unraveling completely. She had been seen shouting at her parents in public, storming out of their home with suitcases in hand. Rumors spread of late-night scenes, of broken glasses, of Cynthia's name whispered in pity. One evening, Alberta received a voicemail that chilled her. Cynthia's voice was slurred, unsteady. "You think you've won, but you destroyed everything. I loved him too, you know, Richard. He was like a father to me. And you—" A sob broke through. "You stole him. You stole everything." The message ended abruptly. No goodbye. For the first time, Alberta sat in silence after listening, her hands trembling slightly. She despised Cynthia, yes, but she had never wished for her destruction. Watching her unravel was unsettling. Was this justice or cruelty stretched too far? That night she dreamed of Richard. He stood in their bedroom, young again, his smile soft. He said nothing, just looked at her with those steady eyes. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears. The next morning she called Harold. "I need to know everything about Cynthia. Where she is, what she's doing." Harold hesitated. "Are you sure you want that?" "Yes." By the afternoon, the reports were in. Cynthia had left David, drained their accounts, and was now living back with her parents, who were exhausted by her volatility. She had no job, no income, no stability. The woman who had stood in Alberta's kitchen and declared her worthless was now sleeping in her childhood bedroom, dependent again. Alberta read the report carefully, then set it aside. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her. Not pity, not quite, but recognition. Cynthia had been cruel, but she had also been young, insecure, desperate to prove herself. And now, stripped bare, she was simply small. That evening, as Alberta sat in her garden, sipping tea, she whispered aloud to the roses. "Revenge and justice are not the same thing. One teaches, the other destroys." She wasn't sure yet which path she had chosen. Days later, David called again. This time his voice was steadier time. "Alberta, Cynthia's gone. For good. She left me with nothing, but maybe that's a gift. I see things clearly now. I see you clearly." Alberta closed her eyes, the ache in her chest both sharp and strange. "Then learn from it, David," she said. "Build something for yourself. Don't repeat her mistakes." When the call ended, Alberta sat in the quiet for a long time. She had reclaimed her house, her fortune, her dignity. She had educated them all through silence, through consequence. But forgiveness, that was another question. One she hadn't answered yet. The Holloway children had been stripped of illusions. Cynthia had collapsed under her own cruelty. And Alberta stood at the center of it all, powerful and alone. The question now was whether she would extend a hand or close the door forever. 6 months had passed since the night she unlocked her own door and told them their time was up. The seasons had shifted. The roses in Alberta's garden had bloomed and died and bloomed again.
Life in the house had settled into rhythm, the quiet tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of leaves through open windows, the silence of rooms that once hummed with other people's voices. For the first time in decades, the silence belonged to her alone. But silence never lasts forever. One gray morning, her phone rang. The hospital number flashed on the screen. For a moment, Alberta considered ignoring it, but something inside her urged her to answer. "Mrs. Morrison," a calm voice said, "this is Dr. Chen at Mercy General. We have a patient here requesting you. David Holloway." Her chest tightened. "Is he—" "He's stable. Car accident, he specifically asked for you." 20 minutes later, Alberta's heels clicked across the sterile white floors of the hospital. The air smelled of antiseptic, the kind of place where lives shifted directions in quiet rooms. She found David in a private room, his leg in a cast, his arm in a sling. He looked smaller than she remembered, pale under the fluorescent lights. "You came," he whispered when he saw her. His eyes, watery and ashamed, searched for her face for something, anger, forgiveness, anything at all. "Of course I came," Alberta said. Her voice was steady, but inside she felt a strange mix of grief and tenderness. He had been 12 when she married Richard, a boy who needed guidance, a boy who she had raised as her own for more than 20 years. And yet when she had needed him most, he had stood silent. "I need to tell you something," David said, his voice cracking. "That night, when Cynthia threw you out, I knew it was wrong. I knew. But I didn't say anything. I let her. I let them. I failed you." Alberta sat beside his bed, her hands folded. His confession was raw, cutting. "Yes," she said quietly, "you did." Tears slipped down his cheeks. "You were more of a mother to me than anyone. You bandaged my scrapes, came to my games, stayed up with me when I was sick. And then when I should have protected you, I stood there like a coward. I've lived with that guilt every day since." For the first time in decades, Alberta's throat tightened with real emotion. She reached for his hand, fragile under the hospital blanket. "You hurt me, deeply. But you also taught me something. I don't need anyone to validate my worth. I know who I am now. I know what I built." David's grip tightened weakly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I see you now. The real you. Not the woman Cynthia painted, not the stepmother I resented, but the one who carried us when we didn't even notice."